Ethan Collins had always valued his self-reliance. A man in his early 40s with a subdued yet authoritative demeanor, he resided in the house his deceased father had bequeathed to him on the fringes of a suburban enclave. The residence was aged, featuring worn bricks and a drooping porch roof, but it was his sanctuary. The true highlight of Ethan's property, however, wasn't the house itself, but the Mustang GT stationed beneath the handcrafted wooden carport in his driveway. The vehicle was more than just an automobile. It was integral to his persona, a link to his late father who had taught him the intricacies of rebuilding engines, fixing bodywork, and breathing life into corroded metal relics. Over the years, Ethan had dedicated himself to restoring the 1970 Mustang GT, transforming it from a dilapidated shell into a flawless, throaty powerhouse. The Mustang's glossy midnight blue finish shimmered under the sunlight, and its engine growled like a beast ready to unleash. Every aspect, from the shiny chrome bumpers to the meticulously sewn leather interior, showcased Ethan's meticulousness and commitment. Neighbors frequently slowed their vehicles to admire it as they passed by his home, though Ethan himself seldom interacted with them. He wasn't fond of casual conversations or community gatherings. He cherished his solitude, spending his nights working with tools in his modest garage or lounging on his porch with a cold drink, watching the sunset. The neighborhood had evolved over time. What was once a peaceful, loosely knit area of independent homeowners had gradually been overtaken by the ever-growing influence of the SAA, or Suburban Association Authority. Ethan had resisted every effort by the SAA to incorporate his property into their jurisdiction. He had no desire to adhere to their bylaws, regulations, or endless stipulations regarding grass height, fence color, or the community's visual harmony. His father had constructed their home long before the SAA existed, and Ethan was steadfast in maintaining that legacy. However, the SAA, headed by the stern and relentless Margaret Hayes, viewed the situation differently. Margaret, in her late 50s with a sharply styled bob haircut and a constant air of superiority, saw herself as the neighborhood's guardian of order and aesthetics. She drove a silver SUV adorned with a bumper sticker that read "Proud SAA President," and her clipboard seemed almost permanently attached to her hand. Margaret's objective was straightforward: bring every residence under the SAA's control, and Ethan's property was a glaring exception on her otherwise immaculate roster. Ethan had previously encountered Margaret, typically resulting in brief and unpleasant interactions. Once, she had stormed up his driveway uninvited, clipboard in hand, to inform him that his carport didn't meet the neighborhood's aesthetic criteria. Ethan, who was engrossed in working on the Mustang at the time, had barely glanced at her before responding that he wasn't interested. She had persisted, mentioning some vague community unity initiative, but Ethan had simply walked into his house and closed the door. That incident had occurred 2 years prior, and Margaret's persistence had only intensified since then. More recently, Ethan had started noticing odd occurrences. Flyers from the SAA began appearing in his mailbox, despite him not being a member. One day, a brightly colored brochure announced that all properties in the vicinity were being reassessed for compliance with the new community standards. On another occasion, he discovered a note affixed to his front door, courteously reminding him to mow his lawn, even though his grass was impeccably trimmed. The most disturbing event, however, was when Ethan found a typed letter stuck under the windshield wiper of the Mustang. The letter read, "Your vehicle does not comply with community standards for appearance and safety. Please remove it within 7 days to avoid further action." Ethan had chuckled upon reading it, crumpling the paper and discarding it. Who were they to dictate what he did with his car? He wasn't part of their SAA, and his property was legally outside their jurisdiction. It was merely another petty attempt by Margaret to assert control, and Ethan chose not to engage. But Margaret Hayes was not someone who accepted refusal lightly. Behind her polished facade and cheerful discourse about community values lay a ruthless edge. To Margaret, Ethan's defiance wasn't just irritating, it was a challenge. She viewed his Mustang as a flaw in her perfect neighborhood vision and was determined to eliminate it by any means necessary. For Ethan, life continued as usual. He spent his weekends detailing the Mustang or taking it out for leisurely drives along rural roads. The engine's roar always seemed to clear his mind. He was a man not easily disturbed, believing the SAA's antics would eventually subside. Yet, a growing unease lingered in the back of his mind. Margaret's persistence felt different this time, as though she was orchestrating something more significant. Then, one morning, Ethan found a new note on his front door. Unlike the previous letters, this one wasn't typed or printed. It was handwritten in a neat, flowing script, and the tone was far less formal. "You've been warned. Remove that eyesore or we will." Ethan's jaw tightened as he read the incomplete message. It wasn't just the threat that unsettled him. The implication was clear. Margaret or someone on her behalf wasn't bluffing. They were escalating their efforts. Ethan decided he'd had enough. He grabbed the note and drove straight to the SAA's office, a neat building on the neighborhood's edge resembling a small courthouse. Inside, Margaret was seated at her desk, conversing with a younger man who seemed to be a new recruit. She barely glanced up when Ethan entered, but when he placed the note on her desk, her demeanor shifted. "What is this, Margaret?" she asked, her voice oozing feigned innocence. "You tell me," Ethan replied. "This appeared on my door this morning." Margaret picked up the note, her eyes narrowing as she read it. "I have no idea who wrote this," she said, returning it to the desk. "But I can assure you our association operates strictly within legal boundaries." "Save it," Ethan shot back. "I'm not part of your SAA, and I never will be. Stay off my property." Margaret's lips curled into a tight smile. "You know, Mr. Collins, it's a pity you don't recognize the value of being part of a community. But I suppose some people just aren't team players." Ethan leaned in closer. "This isn't about community. It's about you trying to control something that isn't yours. Leave me and my property alone." Margaret remained silent, but the glint in her eye indicated she wasn't yielding. As Ethan left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation was far from over. Unbeknownst to him, the struggle for his Mustang and his independence was about to escalate into something dark and destructive. The morning began like any other for Ethan Collins. The sun was just rising, casting a golden hue over the trees lining his tranquil street. Ethan stood in his kitchen, sipping his coffee while casually glancing out the window at his cherished Mustang GT. Even from inside, he could see the sunlight reflecting off the freshly polished hood. For a brief moment, he felt a sense of peace, a small break from the tension that had been mounting between him and Margaret Hayes. The note from the previous day still lay on his counter, a stark reminder that the SAA's interference had reached a new level of hostility. He was about to step outside to check on the car when he felt a subtle tremor beneath his feet. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the vibration intensified, accompanied by a low mechanical rumble. Frowning, Ethan set down his mug and stepped onto the porch. That's when he saw it, a massive yellow bulldozer rolling down the street, its enormous blade gleaming in the early morning light. At the controls, seated high above the chaos like a monarch overseeing her realm, was Margaret Hayes. Ethan froze, his mind racing to comprehend what he was witnessing. The bulldozer slowed as it neared his driveway, then came to a halt directly in front of the Mustang. Margaret sat motionless for a moment, her hands gripping the controls as she fixed her cold, predator-like gaze on the car. Then, without warning, she pressed the controls forward. "Hey, stop!" Ethan shouted, rushing down the steps of his porch. But Margaret either didn't hear him or chose to ignore him. The bulldozer surged forward, its massive blade crashing into the Mustang with a thunderous impact. Ethan's heart sank. The sound of bending metal and shattering glass filled the air as the blade tore through the car's front, ripping apart the hood and exposing the engine beneath. Margaret didn't slow down. She pressed harder, her expression unchanged as the Mustang was pushed backward into the wooden beams of the carport. "Margaret, are you insane?" Ethan yelled, sprinting toward the driveway. Margaret finally brought the bulldozer to a stop. She climbed down from the cab with calculated grace, brushing off non-existent dust from her blazer before turning to face Ethan. "Good morning, Mr. Collins. she said, her tone dripping with artificial sweetness. Ethan stormed toward her, his fists clenched. What the hell do you think you're doing? Margaret raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. I'm enforcing community standards. Your vehicle was a clear violation of the neighborhood's aesthetic guidelines. It had to be removed. Ethan stared at her in disbelief, his chest heaving with anger. You don't have the authority to do this. I'm not part of your SAA. Margaret's lips curled into a smug smile. Ah, but that's where you're mistaken. As of last month, the neighborhood boundaries were officially redrawn to include your property. You're now under our jurisdiction. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, handing it to Ethan. Here's the updated map, along with the new bylaws. You'll see it's all perfectly legal. Ethan snatched the paper from her hands and unfolded it. The map did show his property marked as part of the SAA's territory, but he didn't believe it for a second. This was Margaret's doing, another one of her manipulative power plays to force him into compliance. This is bullshit, he said, crumpling the paper and tossing it to the ground. You can't just redraw boundaries and act like you own my property. Margaret tilted her head, her smile unwavering. The bylaws are quite clear, Mr. Collins. As a member of the SAA, you're required to maintain your property in accordance with community standards. Your car was an eyesore and posed a safety risk. I took appropriate action. Ethan took a step closer, towering over her. That car was on my private property. You had no right to touch it. Margaret's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, a hint of irritation surfaced in her voice. You can argue all you want, but the fact remains that your vehicle is gone. If you have a problem, I suggest you take it up with our legal team. Before Ethan could respond, Margaret turned and walked back toward the bulldozer. She climbed into the cab and gave him one last look, her smug expression firmly in place. Have a nice day, Mr. Collins, she said before driving off, leaving behind a trail of crushed metal and splintered wood. Ethan stood there, his mind swirling with fury and disbelief. His Mustang, the car he had invested years of effort into restoring, was now nothing more than a mangled heap of steel. He felt a deep, primal rage bubbling within him, but beneath it lay an even more profound pain. That car had been more than just a vehicle. It was a part of his life, a connection to his father, and a symbol of his independence. He turned back toward the wreckage, his fists still clenched. The carport was a total loss, its beams splintered and sagging under the weight of the destruction. The Mustang's front end was completely crushed, the engine exposed and warped beyond recognition. Ethan crouched beside the car, running his hand over the jagged edges of the hood. For a moment he sat there, trying to process what had happened. But Ethan wasn't one to succumb to defeat. As the initial shock began to fade, his anger transformed into determination. Margaret Hayes had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to let her get away with it. He stood up, his jaw set in resolve, and pulled out his phone. The first call he made was to the police. He explained what had happened, detailing how Margaret had trespassed onto his property and destroyed his car. The dispatcher listened politely, but informed him that property disputes involving the SAA were considered civil matters and would need to be resolved in court. Ethan hung up, muttering under his breath. Next, he called his lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Rebecca Turner. Rebecca listened intently as Ethan recounted the morning's events, her voice steady and calm as she assured him they had a case. If she destroyed your property without your consent, that's criminal damage, Rebecca said. We'll start by filing a police report, and then we'll examine the legality of those boundary changes she mentioned. I'll need copies of any documents she's given you. Ethan agreed, but as he ended the call, he couldn't shake the feeling that the law might not be sufficient to stop Margaret. She had already shown she was willing to play dirty, and he had no doubt she'd continue to do so. He needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Standing amidst the wreckage of his driveway, Ethan made a silent vow to himself. Margaret Hayes wanted a confrontation. She was about to get one, and this time, he wasn't backing down. Ethan spent the remainder of the day surrounded by the debris of his beloved Mustang, his mind racing with questions and anger simmering just below the surface. The sharp scent of motor oil and splintered wood lingered in the air, a constant reminder of what had been taken from him. Margaret Hayes had overstepped, and though the police had dismissed his complaint as a civil matter, Ethan wasn't going to let this go unanswered. He paced back and forth in his small garage, hands clenching and unclenching as he strategized his next move. The first step was gathering evidence. Margaret had been bold enough to operate the bulldozer herself in broad daylight, but Ethan knew she would try to manipulate the situation in her favor. He accessed the footage from the security camera mounted on the corner of his house. It took a moment for the video to load, but when it did, Ethan felt a surge of vindication. The footage was crystal clear, showing the bulldozer entering his property, Margaret seated confidently at the controls, her expression one of cold determination. The video captured every second of the destruction, the Mustang being crushed under the massive blade, the carport splintering under the assault, and Margaret exiting the cab with her smug, unshakable demeanor. Ethan saved the video and uploaded a copy to a secure cloud drive. He didn't trust Margaret or the SAA to refrain from retaliation, and he needed to ensure this evidence was safe. He also photographed the wreckage from every angle, documenting the extent of the damage to both the car and the property. With this substantial evidence, he felt confident he had a strong case against her, but evidence alone wouldn't stop Margaret. She wasn't the type to relent, and Ethan knew she'd likely start plotting her next move. That thought was confirmed later that evening when he found another letter taped to his front door. This one bore the SAA's official letterhead and read, Shengna, ***, Dear Mr. Collins. Yea. As previously communicated, your vehicle was found to be in violation of community standards due to its unsafe and unsightly condition. In accordance with Section 14B of the SAA bylaws, immediate action was taken to rectify the situation. The removal of the vehicle was necessary to maintain the aesthetic and safety standards of our neighborhood. Should you have any further concerns, you may submit a formal complaint to the SAA board within 30 days. Please note that failure to comply with future directives may result in additional enforcement measures. Sincerely, Margaret Hayes, SAA President. Ethan crumpled the letter in his fist, his teeth grinding as he read Margaret's smug justification. The audacity of her words infuriated him. She was attempting to portray her reckless destruction of his property as a necessary act, hiding behind the facade of SAA regulations he'd never agreed to. Ethan tossed the crumpled paper onto the counter, glaring at it as though it might ignite from his fury. He needed to understand exactly how Margaret had pulled this off. If she was claiming his property now fell under SAA jurisdiction, there had to be paperwork somewhere to support it, or at least something she could use to feign legitimacy. He decided to head straight to the source, the SAA's office. The next morning, Ethan drove to the unassuming building on the neighborhood's edge where the SAA was headquartered. The place was eerily quiet, the parking lot nearly empty. Ethan parked his truck and stepped inside, the faint scent of disinfectant greeting his nose as he walked through the door. The receptionist at the front desk barely glanced up from her computer as he approached. "I need to speak with Margaret Hayes," Ethan said, his voice clipped and tense. The receptionist raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his tone. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Ethan replied, "but I'm not leaving until I talk to her." The receptionist sighed and picked up the phone, muttering something Ethan couldn't hear. A moment later, Margaret emerged from a back office, her expression calm but with a flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Mr. Collins?" she said smoothly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Ethan didn't waste any time. "I want to know how you're claiming my property is under your jurisdiction. Show me the documents." Margaret gestured toward a small conference room. "Why don't we discuss this privately?" Ethan followed her into the room, his jaw tight as she closed the door behind them. Margaret took a seat at the head of the table, opening a sleek leather folder and pulling out a series of papers. She slid one across the table toward Ethan. "This," she said, tapping the document with a perfectly manicured nail, "is the updated neighborhood map approved by the city planning office last month. As you can see, your property now falls within the SAA boundaries. It's all perfectly legal. Ethan picked up the paper, his eyes scanning the map and the accompanying text. The map clearly marked his property within the newly expanded SAA territory, but something about it felt off. The lines appeared hastily drawn, and the accompanying approval stamp seemed too faint, almost as if it had been photocopied. "Let me guess," Ethan said, dropping the paper back onto the table. "You pulled some strings with your contacts in City Hall to get this approved. How much did it cost you?" Margaret's smile didn't falter. "Mr. Collins, I assure you everything was done according to proper channels. If you have an issue, you're welcome to take it up with the city. But as of now, your property is part of the SAA, and you're expected to comply with our standards." Ethan leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You destroyed my car, Margaret. That wasn't enforcement. That was criminal. You think I'm just going to let that slide?" Margaret's smile tightened and her tone grew sharper. "I acted within the authority granted to me by the SAA. If you choose to pursue this, I'm afraid you'll find yourself on the losing side. The bylaws are very clear." Ethan clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain calm. He didn't want to give her the satisfaction of seeing him lose his composure. Instead, he stood up and turned toward the door. "This isn't over," he said without looking back. As Ethan left the office, his mind was already racing with plans. Margaret had made a mistake by showing him that the map was exactly the kind of sloppy, rushed work he could expose. If she thought her connections and flimsy paperwork were enough to protect her, she was in for a rude awakening. That evening, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, poring over every piece of evidence he had gathered so far. The security footage, the photos of the wreckage, the suspicious map, all of it painted a clear picture of Margaret's overreach and corruption. But he knew he needed more. He needed to uncover exactly how she'd managed to push this boundary change through and who else might be involved. Ethan's phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a text from Rebecca Turner, his lawyer. "Got your email? Reviewing everything now. This looks strong. Keep digging." Ethan nodded to himself, his resolve hardening. He wasn't just fighting for his car or his property anymore. This was about standing up to a bully who had operated unchecked for too long. Margaret Hayes had declared war, and Ethan was ready to retaliate. The days following Ethan's tense confrontation with Margaret Hayes were a whirlwind of frustration and determination. Ethan spent countless hours trying to piece together how she had managed to include his property in the SAA's boundaries. The so-called updated map she had shown him was undoubtedly fraudulent, but proving that would take more than just a hunch. It required hard evidence and meticulous work. Every night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and stacks of papers spread out before him. He sifted through public records, city zoning approvals, and anything else he could find about the SAA's jurisdiction. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. The SAA had expanded its boundaries twice in the past 5 years, each time annexing small properties on the edges of its original territory. Most of those properties had been sold off shortly afterward, often to the same real estate development company, Silverstone Developments. Silverstone was a name Ethan recognized. They were notorious for demolishing older homes and replacing them with upscale uniform houses, the kind that sold for triple the price of their construction costs. The company had been linked to shady practices in the past, including pressuring homeowners to sell and using questionable zoning changes to force people out. Ethan couldn't prove it yet, but he was certain Margaret was working with them. His property, with its old house and large lot, was likely a prime target for redevelopment. One evening, as Ethan scrolled through Silverstone's corporate filings, he spotted a familiar name in the list of their local consultants, Daniel Hayes. His stomach churned. Daniel Hayes was Margaret's husband. Suddenly, everything made sense. Margaret wasn't just enforcing SAA rules. She was actively clearing the way for her husband's business interests. The destruction of Ethan's Mustang wasn't about aesthetics or safety. It was a calculated move to intimidate him into selling his property. Armed with this new connection, Ethan reached out to Rebecca Turner, his lawyer. When he informed her about the link between Margaret and Silverstone, Rebecca's voice took on a sharper edge. "This changes everything," she said. "If we can prove a conflict of interest or show that Margaret is using her position for personal gain, we can bring her down. but we'll need solid evidence. Ethan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'll get it, he said. Whatever it takes. The next day, Ethan decided to take a more direct approach. He knew Margaret wouldn't be careless enough to leave incriminating evidence lying around the SAA office, but there was another potential source of information at her house. Margaret lived in one of the largest homes in the neighborhood, a sprawling two-story colonial with manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges. Ethan had driven past it many times, but this time he parked his truck a block away and approached on foot. It was late, and most of the neighborhood was dark, save for a few porch lights and the occasional flicker of a TV in a window. Margaret's house, however, was well lit, with lights on both floors and a faint glow emanating from the backyard. Ethan crouched behind a row of bushes, his heart pounding as he watched for any sign of movement. Margaret's SUV was parked in the driveway, but her husband's car was missing. Ethan waited, tense and alert, until he saw Margaret step out onto the porch. She stood there for a moment, sipping from a glass of wine and gazing out at the street. Ethan held his breath, remaining as still as possible. After a few minutes, she went back inside and the porch light flicked off. Ethan waited another half hour to ensure she was asleep before making his move. He crept around to the back of the house, where he'd noticed a home office during one of his previous drives-by. The window was slightly open, letting in the cool night air. Ethan peered inside and saw a desk cluttered with papers, a laptop, and a filing cabinet. His first instinct was to climb inside and start searching, but he hesitated. Breaking into her house would cross a line, and if he got caught, it would only give Margaret ammunition against him. Instead, Ethan pulled out his phone and zoomed in through the window, snapping photos of the desk and its contents. One of the documents caught his eye. It was labeled Silverstone Development's projected plans. The realization sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He couldn't see the details from his vantage point, but it was enough to prove that Margaret was working directly with Silverstone. If he could obtain that document, he might be able to connect the dots between Margaret, the SAA's boundary changes, and the destruction of his Mustang. Ethan retreated, carefully retracing his steps back to the street. As he walked back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He glanced over his shoulder but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and he quickened his pace. The following morning, Ethan sent the photos to Rebecca. "This is a start," she said, "but we need to get those documents. I'll file a subpoena, but that could take weeks. In the meantime, we should look for other ways to pressure Margaret." Ethan knew exactly where to begin. He reached out to some of his neighbors, people who had lived in the area long enough to remember what the neighborhood was like before the SAA took control. One of them, an older man named Frank, had been forced to sell his property 5 years ago when the SAA declared his home unsafe due to minor code violations. "They wouldn't leave me alone," Frank said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Every week it was something new, a fine for overgrown bushes, a warning about my fence being too short. They just wore me down until I gave up and sold. I didn't know it at the time, but the company that bought my house was tied to Silverstone. I bet they'd been pulling the strings all along." Frank's story was eerily similar to what Ethan was experiencing, solidifying his resolve to expose Margaret. He spent the next few days gathering testimonies from other neighbors who had been pressured or bullied by the SAA. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, painting a clear picture of systemic abuse and corruption. As the evidence mounted, Margaret seemed to grow more desperate. One night, Ethan returned home to find his driveway blocked by a large pile of debris, broken branches, scraps of wood, and even an old mattress. A note taped to the pile read, "Keep pushing, and this will seem like nothing." Ethan's blood boiled, but he refused to let her intimidate him. Instead, he called a local waste removal company and had the debris hauled away the next morning. When the workers asked where to dispose of it, Ethan didn't hesitate. "Take it to the SAA office," he said. The gesture was petty, but it sent a message that Ethan wasn't backing down. The tipping point came later that week when Rebecca called him with urgent news. "We just accessed some of Silverstone's internal documents," she said. There's a paper trail showing they've been funneling money to Margaret in exchange for pushing boundary changes and clearing properties for redevelopment. This is the smoking gun we needed. Ethan felt a surge of vindication, but he knew the fight wasn't over. With the evidence in hand, Rebecca began drafting a formal complaint to the city and preparing for a lawsuit against Margaret and the SAA. Ethan, meanwhile, continued to rally his neighbors, urging them to stand up against the corruption that had taken root in their community. As he stood on his porch that evening, looking out at the wreckage of the Mustang, Ethan felt a renewed sense of purpose. Margaret had underestimated him, and she was about to learn that some battles couldn't be won with threats and bulldozers. This was his home, his life, and he wasn't going to let her take it away. The tranquility of Ethan's evenings had been replaced by constant unease. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. Every faint sound outside his window set him on edge. Margaret Hayes wasn't just a petty tyrant hiding behind SAA bylaws anymore. She was escalating her tactics, and Ethan could feel the noose tightening. The debris left in his driveway was a clear message that Margaret wasn't done with him yet, but Ethan wasn't done either. The week had been a whirlwind of progress on the legal front. Rebecca had filed the initial complaint against Margaret and the SAA, presenting evidence of the fraudulent boundary changes and the clear connection to Silverstone developments. It was enough to launch an investigation into the SAA's practices, but Ethan knew Margaret wouldn't take it lying down, and she didn't. It started with subtle annoyances. A notice appeared in his mailbox claiming he owed back dues to the SAA, a laughable claim since he wasn't and never had been a member. The amount was absurdly high, $15,000. The letter threatened a lien on his property if payment wasn't made within 30 days. Ethan crumpled it and tossed it aside, refusing to be baited. The next night, he came home to find a city inspector waiting in his driveway. The man, wearing a high-visibility vest and carrying a clipboard, informed Ethan that there had been an anonymous complaint about code violations on his property. The inspector was polite but firm, walking the perimeter of Ethan's land with a critical eye. When he was done, he handed Ethan a list of supposed infractions: an unsafe shed, overgrown vegetation near the fence line, and an unapproved structure, the remains of the carport Margaret had destroyed. Ethan bit back his frustration and asked for a copy of the complaint. The inspector shook his head. "Anonymous," he said. "I don't need to ask who's behind it." Margaret was using every tool at her disposal to pressure him, and the inspection was just another weapon in her arsenal. Still, Ethan wasn't about to let her win. He spent the next morning cleaning up the property, trimming the bushes and cutting back the vegetation by the fence. The shed, which had been perfectly fine before, required a few hours of repairs to bring it up to code. By the time he finished, Ethan was exhausted, but the sense of accomplishment was worth it. He refused to give Margaret the satisfaction of seeing him falter, but Margaret wasn't done. The day after the inspection, Ethan woke to the sound of a loud crash outside. He rushed to the front door and found his mailbox lying in pieces on the ground, its posts snapped clean in half. Tire tracks in the dirt indicated someone had deliberately backed over it. Ethan shook his head, his jaw tightening. This was more than harassment. It was intimidation. He spent the morning installing a new mailbox, this time reinforcing it with a metal post and concrete base. As he worked, he felt eyes on him. Turning toward the street, he saw Margaret's silver Toyota parked a few houses down, the tinted windows revealing nothing. Ethan's skin prickled. She wasn't even trying to hide her involvement anymore. That night, Ethan decided he couldn't afford to sit idly by any longer. Margaret had gone too far, and it was time to take the fight to her. Armed with his growing collection of evidence, Ethan reached out to several of his neighbors, focusing on those who had shared stories of their own run-ins with Margaret. He proposed a meeting at his house, hoping to unite them against the SAA's abuses. The turnout surprised him. Nearly a dozen people showed up, some bringing documents, others just wanting to vent about their experiences. One elderly woman named Linda recounted how Margaret had fined her for planting unauthorized flowers in her front yard. Another neighbor, a young couple, revealed that they had been charged thousands of dollars in fines for minor infractions like leaving their garbage bins out overnight. The stories painted a picture of the SAA operating like a dictatorship, with Margaret at its helm. Ethan listened carefully, jotting down notes and making copies of any documents they were willing to share. As the meeting progressed, a sense of solidarity began to form among the group. For the first time, Ethan felt like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. But the sense of unity was short-lived. The next morning, Ethan woke to find the remnants of a fire smoldering near the edge of his property. Someone had piled brush and garbage there and set it ablaze during the night. The fire hadn't spread far thanks to the damp ground, but the message was clear. Margaret, or someone working on her behalf, was escalating the pressure. Ethan called the fire department to document the incident and filed a report with the police, though he knew it was unlikely to lead anywhere. Without direct evidence linking Margaret to the fire, it was just another unexplained act of vandalism. Still, the incident only strengthened his resolve. Later that day, Rebecca called with news. "I filed a motion to depose Margaret," she said. "If we can get her under oath, she'll have to answer questions about her connection to Silverstone and those boundary changes. It's a strong move, but it'll take time to schedule." Time wasn't something Ethan felt he had. Margaret was becoming more desperate, and the lengths she was willing to go were growing more dangerous. That night, Ethan installed additional cameras around his property, focusing on the areas near the fence line and driveway. He also reinforced the locks on his doors and windows, knowing that Margaret's tactics could escalate to something more direct. His precautions paid off sooner than he expected. 2 nights later, the cameras captured footage of 2 men sneaking onto his property. One carried a spray can, the other a crowbar. They moved toward Ethan's shed, whispering to each other as they worked. Ethan watched the live feed on his phone, his adrenaline surging. He grabbed the shotgun he kept in his bedroom and quietly stepped out onto the porch, staying in the shadows. "Hey!" he barked, his voice cutting through the night. The men froze, the crowbar clattering to the ground. Ethan raised the shotgun, aiming it squarely at them. Said, "You've got 5 seconds to leave my property before I call the cops." The men scrambled, tripping over themselves as they fled toward the street. Ethan didn't lower the shotgun until they disappeared into the darkness. He reviewed the footage later, zooming in on their faces. One of them was vaguely familiar, a man he'd seen working on Margaret's lawn a few weeks ago. The next morning, Ethan sent the footage to Rebecca, along with a detailed account of what had happened. "This is it," she said. "We can use this to argue that Margaret is creating a hostile environment and endangering her neighbors. Combined with everything else, this significantly strengthens our case." Ethan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret still had something up her sleeve. She'd been too brazen, too confident, as if she believed she was untouchable. But Ethan wasn't about to let her win. He'd come too far, and he was ready for whatever came next. The second escalation had pushed Ethan to his limits, but it had also revealed something important. Margaret's desperation was her weakness. The more she pushed, the more careless she became, and Ethan was determined to use that to his advantage. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Ethan felt like he had the upper hand. The air in the crowded community hall was thick with tension as Ethan stood at the front of the room, his evidence neatly stacked on the table beside him. The meeting had been called by Margaret Hayes, ostensibly to address misunderstandings and complaints about the SAA. It was a classic move to frame herself as the voice of reason while portraying Ethan as a troublemaker. But Ethan had no intention of letting her control the narrative. Margaret arrived fashionably late, her silver blazer immaculate and her expression exuding confidence. She swept into the room, her clipboard tucked under her arm, and took her place at the center of the table, flanked by 2 members of the SAA board. Her supporters, carefully chosen allies among the residents, filled the front rows, their whispers of approval echoing through the hall. "Good evening, everyone," Margaret began, her voice smooth and composed. "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. As you know, our community thrives on cooperation and mutual respect. Unfortunately, recent events have created some discord, and I feel it's important to address these matters openly." Ethan watched her carefully, his jaw tight. She was setting the stage, positioning herself as the savior of the neighborhood. He waited, letting her dig herself deeper. I understand that some residents feel the SAA's actions have been overly strict, Margaret continued, her eyes briefly flicking toward Ethan. But every decision we make is in service of maintaining the high standards that make this neighborhood a desirable place to live. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. High standards, he said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. Destroying my car was about high standards. Setting fires on my property was about high standards. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Margaret's smile faltered for a split second before she regained her composure. Mr. Collins, I understand you're upset, but these accusations are baseless. The SAA acted within its authority to address a vehicle that was in clear violation of our guidelines. Save it, Ethan interrupted, stepping forward. He held up a flash drive. I have proof. Proof that you've been lying to everyone here, abusing your power, and using the SAA to line your pockets. Margaret's face hardened. Mr. Collins, this is highly inappropriate. What's inappropriate? Ethan demanded. Using your position as SAA president to help your husband's company seize people's homes? Redrawing boundaries, fabricating violations, and intimidating your neighbors into selling their properties for peanuts? The crowd erupted into murmurs, some of Margaret's supporters exchanging uncertain glances, others staring at the screen with a mix of disbelief and anger. Margaret straightened her shoulders, her voice sharp as she said, These are outrageous claims. Unless you have evidence to support them, I suggest you sit down before you embarrass yourself further. Ethan smirked. Oh, I've got evidence, plenty of it. He handed the flash drive to a community member who had volunteered to operate the projector. Moments later, the screen behind him lit up, displaying security footage of Margaret operating the bulldozer that had destroyed his Mustang. The crowd gasped. That's just the beginning, Ethan said, pacing in front of the screen. The next image is a close-up of the fraudulent map Margaret showed me, followed by documents showing payments from Silverstone Developments to Margaret's personal account. He continued, playing footage of the two men trespassing on his property, including the moment one of them mentioned Margaret's name. Margaret Hayes isn't protecting this community, Ethan declared, turning to face the crowd. She's selling it out. Every decision she makes, every fine she issues, is part of a plan to drive people out and hand their homes over to Silverstone Developments, her husband's company. Margaret's carefully constructed mask cracked. Her face flushed, and she rose from her seat, her voice trembling with fury. This is a smear campaign. He's twisting facts and spreading lies. Lies, Ethan countered, stepping closer to her. The payments are right there. The boundary changes are right there. You think these people are stupid, Margaret? You think they're just going to believe you over their own eyes? Margaret's allies looked increasingly uncomfortable, some whispering among themselves, others staring at the screen with a mix of disbelief and anger. One man in the back stood and said, My mother lost her house last year because of you. Now I understand why. Another voice joined in, then another, until the room was filled with shouts of outrage. Margaret tried to regain control, her voice rising above the chaos. You have no right to accuse me of these things. Everything I've done has been within the law. Then why are you so nervous? Ethan asked, his voice calm but cutting. Why did you try to intimidate me? Why did you send those men to vandalize my property? Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The weight of the evidence and the crowd's growing anger was too much. She turned to the SAA board members for support, but they avoided her gaze, clearly unwilling to stand by her. Ethan crossed his arms, letting the silence hang in the air before delivering the final blow. You're done, Margaret. The investigation into you and Silverstone is already underway. It's over. Margaret stood frozen for a moment before grabbing her clipboard and storming out of the room. The slam of the door echoed through the hall, followed by a moment of stunned silence. Then, one by one, the residents began clapping. The applause grew louder, turning into cheers as they stood in support of Ethan. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt the tension in his chest begin to ease. Margaret's reign was over, and the neighborhood had finally seen her for what she truly was. The fight wasn't entirely over. There were still legal battles ahead. But this was a victory, one he had fought hard for, and one he wouldn't forget. The fallout from the meeting was swift and decisive. Margaret Hayes's meticulously curated image as the neighborhood's guardian of order and harmony crumbled under the weight of Ethan's evidence. By the next morning, word had spread through the community like wildfire. Her once loyal supporters abandoned her, neighbors whispered about her corruption, and the SAA board scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Margaret resigned from her position as SAA president within 24 hours, citing personal reasons, but the damage had already been done. Investigators from the city planning office confirmed that the boundary changes she had pushed through were riddled with irregularities, and a deeper probe into Silverstone developments revealed their involvement in predatory practices. The financial ties between Margaret and Silverstone were undeniable, and lawsuits began piling up against both her and the company. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. Margaret's downfall couldn't bring back the years of effort he had poured into his Mustang or erase the frustration and anger he'd endured. But as he stood in his driveway, looking at the wreckage of the carport and the mangled remains of his once pristine car, he felt a sense of closure. The battle had been worth it. Over the following weeks, Ethan worked tirelessly to rebuild. With the settlement money he received from the SAA, he ordered parts and tools to begin restoring the Mustang. Though the task was daunting, Ethan wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Each dent he hammered out, each piece of warped metal he replaced, felt like reclaiming a part of himself. Neighbors stopped by occasionally, offering words of encouragement or bringing coffee and snacks. Many had been inspired by Ethan's fight and were determined to ensure that the SAA never abused its power again. The final blow to Margaret came when her house, her prized fortress of suburban perfection, was listed for sale. Rumors swirled about her moving to another state, though most suspected she was simply running from the humiliation. Silverstone Developments, too, faced a reckoning with city officials imposing heavy fines and revoking permits for several pending projects. The neighborhood, once gripped by fear and compliance, began to heal. Months later, Ethan's Mustang stood proudly in his driveway once more. It wasn't perfect. There were still small imperfections from the damage, reminders of the battle he had fought. But to Ethan, it was more than just a car. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to standing up against corruption and bullying. The neighborhood came together for a barbecue to celebrate the new beginnings. The event was hosted in Ethan's yard, his rebuilt Mustang taking center stage. Residents who had once kept their heads down now mingled freely, laughing and sharing stories. Ethan, standing by his car with a drink in hand, felt a rare sense of peace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, a neighbor approached Ethan, a young couple who had just moved in. The husband looked at the Mustang with wide eyes, his admiration clear. "That's a beautiful car," he said. "You don't see many like that anymore." Ethan smiled, running a hand along the polished hood. "This one's been through hell," he said, "but it's still standing." The couple nodded, and the wife added, "So is this neighborhood." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with quiet pride. He looked out over the gathering, neighbors united and free from Margaret's oppressive shadow. It wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for all of them. Ethan raised his drink in a silent toast to the Mustang, the neighborhood, and the hard-won peace they had finally achieved.
Ethan Carter had always been a man who avoided stirring up conflict. For nearly 15 years he had lived in the same modest home, keeping largely to himself while diligently tending to what was his. His residence was more than a shelter. It was a sanctuary painstakingly maintained over the years. Working as a mechanic, Ethan had developed a natural talent for repairing and reinforcing things, making them stronger and built to last. Every detail of his property, including the meticulously shaped hedges in his front yard, spoke to his commitment. Those hedges were not merely ornamental. They defined the boundary of his domain and symbolized the order and precision he brought to his life. He had planted them with his own hands, nurtured them through harsh winters and scorching summers alike, and pruned them with deliberate care. The living evidence of his patience and mastery over his environment had long been a comfort to him in a world that often felt chaotic. Then, one morning, Ethan awoke to find that his cherished hedges had been flattened. Initially, he assumed it was a mere accident, a driver misjudging a turn and inadvertently clipping the edge before speeding away. When the incident repeated a few days later, with tire marks gouging the soil, branches snapped, and entire segments of the hedge uprooted, Ethan realized the damage was deliberate. Someone was purposefully targeting his boundary, but for what reason? Determined to uncover the culprit, he altered his routine that following week, waking earlier and staying up later, vigilantly watching from his porch with a quiet intensity. Yet, no matter how alert he was, the vandalism continued whenever he wasn't watching. A late-night grocery run, or even a brief moment of distraction, meant another portion of his hedge would vanish. Conversations with his neighbors yielded little help. The residents across the street were too absorbed in their own affairs, or preferred not to get involved. Even Mrs. Hargrove, the elderly woman who usually sat on her front step, could only offer a resigned shake of her head and a remark that the miscreants arrived under the cover of darkness, moving quickly as if they feared being caught. Soon enough, Ethan began finding small fragments of plastic and metal among the broken branches. As someone who worked with machinery day in and day out, he recognized that the debris suggested a vehicle far heftier than a standard sedan was involved, one that had been deliberately plowing through his hedge with considerable force. Ethan approached the local planning board for assistance, only to be met with bureaucratic indifference and dismissive shrugs. One representative suggested, almost as an afterthought, that perhaps Ethan should simply consider repositioning his hedge. That comment sparked a revelation in Ethan. Someone intended for his barrier to disappear entirely. His hedge wasn't just an irritation to a reckless driver. It was a hindrance to an agenda he had no part in. Knowing when to adapt his strategy, Ethan set about fortifying his hedge. He reinforced its base by embedding steel rods into the soil and anchoring the roots with heavy stones hidden from plain sight. His modifications were subtle yet effective, designed to surprise anyone who dared to run through it again. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask for a favor. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and it's my absolute dream to once reach this. So if you enjoy my content, please subscribe. On to the story. That very night, after completing the reinforcements, Ethan retired to bed without keeping watch. However, sometime after midnight, the unmistakable sound of metal scraping against a resistant surface roused him. Rushing to his front door, he discovered the tail lights of a black SUV fading away down the street, accompanied by fresh, deep tire marks and a fragment of shattered headlight casing lying on the ground. This time, Ethan had tangible evidence. Holding the headlight piece in his hand, he immediately recognized the model. It belonged not to an ordinary vehicle, but to an armored, custom-fitted SUV, one clearly owned by someone with both wealth and influential connections. The thought that such a vehicle would have any reason to trample through a suburban hedge in the dead of night set his mind racing. Without delay, Ethan made several discreet calls to friends who managed local auto repair shops. His suspicions were confirmed when one of them mentioned a customer earlier that morning seeking a replacement headlight for a black reinforced SUV. The man behind the inquiry was none other than Darren Ellis, a contractor with deep connections in local real estate developments. Darren, who had been quietly advocating for new road expansions that conveniently cut through Ethan's neighborhood, had now revealed his hand. It was clear that the repeated acts of vandalism were not random. They were calculated tests to force Ethan out of his own property. Ethan's response was as measured as it was resolute. He chose not to report the incidents or issue threats. Instead, he waited patiently, confident that if the perpetrators returned, he would be ready. To him, this struggle was no longer simply about a hedge. It had grown into a matter of control and personal dignity. He resolved that if they expected him to capitulate, they would soon learn how mistaken they were. In the following days, Ethan carried on with his routine outwardly, exchanging small pleasantries with his neighbors and continuing his work at the auto shop. Yet every night, he stayed up late, tools meticulously arranged on his workbench, mentally rehearsing every possible scenario. His intuition proved correct when, 3 nights later, around 2 a.m., he heard the low rumble of an engine. From behind the drawn blinds of his dim living room, he watched as the same black SUV approached slowly before hesitating momentarily, as if its driver were rethinking the move, then accelerating forward. This time, the impact was notably different. The reinforced hedge held its ground. There was no smooth, clean cut as before. The hidden steel and concrete barriers had done their job, causing the SUV to collide with a formidable, immovable force. The collision was accompanied by a disheartening crunch of twisted metal and a curse that shattered the stillness of the night. When Ethan stepped onto his porch, he observed Darren Ellis emerging unsteadily from the wrecked vehicle, clearly in pain and rage. A small duffel bag had spilled from the passenger seat, its contents, stacks of paperwork, documents, and what unmistakably resembled blueprints, scattered on the pavement. "Damn it," Darren muttered, as he kicked the damaged SUV. His fury was swiftly tempered by a flash of fear when he noticed Ethan standing silently on the porch, his head tilted slightly. "Having car trouble," Ethan remarked coolly. Darren's glare offered no answer as he fumbled with his phone, undoubtedly summoning assistance. Ethan let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of Darren's failure to register. He had been caught, not by the police or the media, but by the very man he presumed would be an easy mark. The next morning, Ethan awoke, replaying the previous night's events. The image of Darren Ellis beside his wrecked SUV seared into his memory. The damage to the vehicle was extensive. A crumpled hood, shattered headlight, and a leaking radiator all bore testimony to the violent encounter. Yet what troubled Ethan most was the duffel bag's contents. Years spent among construction workers and contractors had taught him to recognize blueprints immediately. These were no ordinary documents related to a routine road expansion. They were secret plans of a private nature, not meant for public eyes. Darren's desperate attempt to hide the papers only confirmed to Ethan that this was a matter far greater than a petty act of vandalism. Recognizing that involving the authorities would be futile, especially when men like Darren Ellis had the clout to ensure that any official complaint would vanish into bureaucratic oblivion, Ethan resolved to investigate on his own. His first step was gathering information. That afternoon, he made several inconspicuous phone calls to old contacts in the construction and land development sectors. Posing as a concerned citizen, he learned that rumors of a clandestine real estate deal had been circulating for some time. A major development project that had not yet been publicly announced. The only source of reliable details came from those closely connected with the contractors involved, and repeatedly one name surfaced: Ellis Properties, Darren Ellis's firm. Ethan slowly came to the realization that if Darren was aggressively pushing for this secret development, his property was viewed as an obstacle, likely the last remaining privately owned lot blocking a grand scheme. This explained the intimidation tactics. Initially, they had attempted to harass him into abandoning his land, and when that did not work, they escalated to actively damaging his property. Now, having inflicted physical costs upon them, Ethan allowed himself a bitter chuckle, confident that Darren was far from pleased with the turn of events. Late that afternoon, Ethan decided to take a drive to follow up on a detail he had noticed the previous night. Darren's immediate, furtive phone check after the collision. It was clear he had been texting someone, an indication that Darren was not acting on his own but was reporting to a higher authority. With that thought in mind, Ethan headed to a commercial district where Ellis Properties maintained a modest brick office building with tinted windows and a plainly displayed logo. Parking a few blocks away, he waited in his truck, until he saw what remained of Darren's SUV parked in the lot behind the building. Not alone, either. A sleek black luxury sedan was parked nearby. Out of the sedan stepped a sharply dressed man in his mid-40s, his confident gait and guarded demeanor marking him as someone used to wielding authority without question. Though Ethan did not approach closely, the scene confirmed that Darren Ellis was not the mastermind, but rather a subordinate answering to someone larger. This individual did not merely desire Ethan's hedge to be removed, they wanted his entire property. A mixture of frustration and dangerous curiosity gripped Ethan. For the next few tense days, he maintained a low profile, wary of attracting attention while awaiting the next move from his unseen adversaries. Then, on a crisp Tuesday morning, an official-looking letter arrived in his mailbox bearing the return address of Ellis Properties. Ethan tore it open and read its contents, a buyout offer that was startlingly generous, far exceeding the actual market value of his property. Yet the tone was icy and laden with legal jargon, leaving no doubt that it was not a friendly invitation, but an ultimatum demanding his immediate departure. Setting the letter aside, Ethan felt his jaw tighten in resolve. The game was no longer one of polite negotiations. Later that evening, as he worked on an old carburetor in his garage, deliberate footsteps echoed outside, measured and purposeful, not the casual tread of a passer-by. Ethan dimmed the light and crept toward the garage door, his heart pounding. Moments later, a heavy thud struck the side of his house, then another closer to the front door. The intruder's actions were clearly premeditated. Gripping a crowbar, a relic of past experiences, Ethan edged toward the door until he cautiously cracked it open. In the darkness, he found a brick left on his porch with a handwritten note wrapped around it. The note bore only 6 terse words. "You should take the money, Carter." The message was unmistakable. They were issuing a final warning, asserting control. Clenching the note in his fist, Ethan stepped back inside, his determination solidifying. If they believed he would be intimidated, they were gravely mistaken. That night, with his front door securely locked and his senses heightened, Ethan sat at his kitchen table with a beer in hand, mulling over the gravity of the situation. He was well aware that the repeated destruction of his hedge had been only the beginning, the buyout letter merely a precursor to further intimidation. It was clear that his property, and by extension his independence, was the next target. The following morning, rather than overtly announcing his defenses, he discreetly reinforced his home. He replaced the screws in his doors with longer ones, bolstered the door frames, and recalibrated his outdoor motion sensors for greater sensitivity. A quick inspection of his garage revealed that although his tools were undisturbed, something felt amiss, as if the very air around him had shifted. His suspicions were confirmed when he discovered that the fuel line on his truck had been expertly slit, a precise cut that might have gone unnoticed until it was too late. The attack was not simply a financial maneuver, it was an assertion of power, a demonstration that his adversaries could reach into his life whenever they pleased. Having learned from years spent around men who employed ruthless tactics, Ethan knew that an impulsive, emotional response would only play into their hands. Instead, he resolved to draw them out and force them into making a mistake, all the while avoiding a direct emotional reaction that might jeopardize his position. Late that night, as he sat in his darkened living room, he watched the street intently. Shortly after midnight, a sleek black sedan pulled up a few houses down. The suited man inside stepped out with measured steps, clearly on a mission. Ethan allowed him to approach his porch, and after counting silently to 5, he opened the door. The visitor was tall, mid-40s, impeccably groomed with a sharp, cold gaze. With a courteous but unmistakable air of authority, the man greeted him. "Mr. Carter." Ethan replied coolly, "I don't believe we've met." The stranger chuckled softly and commented as he glanced around the interior of the house, "You're making this unnecessarily complicated. We extended you a very fair offer, yet you haven't responded." Ethan produced the crumpled note he had found and said, "Your message was received loud and clear." The man's smile widened ever so slightly. "That wasn't from me," he said evenly. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you here? Is this just a friendly visit?" The man's tone shifted as he stated, "Consider this your final opportunity to accept the deal before matters become unpleasant." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "You mean before you damage my property further?" The stranger's expression faltered for a moment, a subtle crack in his otherwise steely demeanor, before he recovered his composure. "No one desires chaos, Mr. Carter," he said. "But if you persist, you leave us no alternative." Without flinching, Ethan responded, "If you or anyone associated with you dares set foot on my property again, I won't be contacting lawyers or calling the police. I'll be prepared to take matters into my own hands." The suited man regarded him silently for a long moment, then sighed as he turned toward his waiting sedan. "I'm afraid that's too bad," he remarked, "but you were warned." As the sedan pulled away, Ethan examined the business card the man had left behind. There was no name, only a phone number. Over the next 2 days, an oppressive quiet settled over the neighborhood, an ominous sign that his adversaries were preparing their next move. On the third day, Ethan discovered a grim message. A dead stray dog lay near his mailbox, its neck cruelly broken without any sign of struggle. A clear message intended to unsettle him. With a clenched fist, he buried the animal in his backyard, feeling the tension surge within him. That night, he turned off his porch light and lay in wait. At around 3 a.m., he heard the soft click of a lock being tampered with near the side of his house. Stealthily, Ethan slipped out the back door, moving silently toward his garage. From his concealed vantage point, he spied a young man, no older than his early 20s, dressed in all black, fiddling with the lock on his garage door. In a burst of controlled fury, Ethan charged forward and struck the intruder's knee with the crowbar, eliciting a strangled yell as the young man crumpled to the ground. Grabbing the assailant by the collar, Ethan dragged him into the garage and secured the door. Kneeling down with the crowbar gripped tightly, Ethan demanded, "Who sent you?" The young man, teeth clenched and voice trembling, remained silent at first. Pressing the cold metal against his throat, Ethan repeated, "Who sent you?" After a long, tense pause, the intruder finally gasped, "Sullivan." The single word sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Releasing the man, he ordered, "Get out of here, and tell Sullivan he's made a terrible mistake." The young man scrambled to his feet and limped away into the darkness, leaving Ethan standing alone in the garage, his knuckles white with the weight of the confrontation. This was no longer about money, it had become a declaration of war. The following morning, with grim determination, Ethan decided to take the offensive. He dialed the number on the business card without hesitation. After a couple of rings, a calm voice answered, not Sullivan's, but that of the suited man from the previous night. "Mr. Carter," the voice said smoothly, "I was hoping you would call." Ethan replied evenly, "We need to meet in person. Same location as before, around noon." Without another word, he hung up and spent the next few hours preparing himself mentally and physically. He was not going into this blind. He knew that men like these would try to bully him into a buyout, but he had no interest in selling his property. He wanted to see them forced to confront him. At exactly noon, Ethan drove into the parking lot behind the Ellis Properties office building. The black sedan was already waiting with its heavily tinted windows hiding its occupant's expression. Exiting his truck, he found the suited man standing calmly. "I appreciate you coming, Mr. Carter," the man said. Ethan wasted no time. "I want to speak with Mr. Ellis." The man's smile was thin and unamused as he replied, "Mr. Ellis is a busy man." Ethan crossed his arms and said, "I've had enough of your people breaking into my garage and terrorizing me." For a brief moment, the suited man's features tightened. but he quickly recovered. "I'm sorry, but you're fighting a losing battle," he remarked. "No one is coming to your rescue. All you need to do to resolve this is to sign the papers." Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice. "Let me be clear. I do not scare easily. I refuse to take orders from men in suits who believe they own everything. And if you, Mr. Ellis, or anyone else sets foot on my property again, I won't be calling lawyers or the cops." The suited man sighed, almost disappointed, and then turned toward his sedan. "That's unfortunate," he said, "but consider this your final warning." Ethan watched as the sedan merged back into traffic, feeling that the confrontation was far from over. Later that night, while Ethan kept vigilant watch from his home, he noticed a large black truck idling at the far end of the street, its headlights off. His pulse quickened. This was not an ordinary threat, but a sign that his enemies were prepared to escalate. Grabbing his shotgun from behind the kitchen door, he stepped outside and fired a single warning shot into the air. The truck skidded to a halt, and after a brief pause, it reversed slowly and disappeared. Clutching the shotgun, Ethan felt a mix of anger and resolve. They had tried to run him down, but he would not allow them to intimidate him into submission. Fueled by the need for a counterattack, Ethan drove straight to City Hall. He didn't have direct evidence of the threats, but he possessed something far more powerful: documents. Requesting every public record related to Ellis Properties' recent projects, every permit, zoning change, and financial document filed in the last year, he pored over the records for hours. Deep among the bureaucratic paperwork, he discovered a document signed 6 months earlier that granted Ellis Properties the rights to develop commercial property on land that had not yet been sold, land that included his own property. The realization hit him hard. They had already claimed his land on paper, pushing the transaction through before even offering him a fair buyout. The vandalism, the intimidating letters, the physical sabotage, it had all been orchestrated because they were convinced of their victory. But now, Ethan held the evidence he needed. He immediately made copies of the document and sent them to the local newspaper, several city council members, and a lawyer who had previously dismissed his case. This wasn't just a personal battle anymore. It was a mission to expose their entire operation. Later that evening, as he sat on his porch with a beer in hand, he waited for the inevitable fallout. It came sooner than expected. A police cruiser pulled up, a stark contrast to the earlier vehicles. 2 officers emerged, one older with graying hair, and the other younger and more intense. The older officer addressed him. "Mr. Carter, we need to talk." Ethan set his beer aside calmly. "About what?" the officer asked, and after a measured pause, he replied, "Darren Ellis is missing." Ethan's calm remained unbroken as the younger officer added that there had been reports of a break-in at Darren's premises the previous night, with security footage wiped and witnesses noting someone in a truck resembling Ethan's. A slow smile crept onto Ethan's face as he realized that they were now attempting to frame him. "I was here all night," he said confidently, "and I've got security footage to prove it." The officers exchanged a look, and the older one finally closed his notepad. "Just don't leave town, Mr. Carter," he warned before departing. Ethan watched the cruiser's taillights fade into the distance. Darren Ellis's disappearance was a development he hadn't expected. It suggested that someone had taken drastic measures to cover their tracks, and now Ethan was the only loose end left. Realizing that the situation was spiraling, he knew he needed answers and leverage. By sunrise the next day, Ethan found himself parked outside the modest Ellis Properties office once more. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the sleek black sedan had vanished, suggesting that the suited man and his cohorts were lying low. Determined not to leave empty-handed, he strode into the building. At the reception desk, a weary woman in her mid-30s looked up with tired eyes and murmured, "You're not supposed to be here." Ethan responded with a polite smile. "Neither is your boss, I'm afraid." The woman's expression shifted, She hesitated before confiding softly, "They instructed me to keep my mouth shut." Drawing a chair closer, Ethan continued, "I don't care about the shady deals going on, but I know Darren was scared. He kept taking secret calls, locking his office, and mentioning a name, Langley." The receptionist shook her head. "I'm not sure who Langley is," she whispered, "but Darren often said he wouldn't let Langley push him out. That name suggests there's someone bigger at play." Before Ethan could ask further, the woman stiffened as a black SUV slowly pulled into the lot outside. "They're watching," she breathed. Nodding silently, Ethan left the building with a heavy heart and drove home while taking convoluted routes to avoid detection. For the next several days, no overt threats materialized. It was a deceptive calm, a lull before the coming storm. Ethan spent this time fortifying his home further, installing additional motion sensors and reinforcing every entry point. Then, on the fourth night, he detected a faint scraping sound near his garage, deliberate and unnerving. Clutching his shotgun, he crept toward the window and saw a shadowy figure near his truck, presumably attempting to tamper with the fuel line once more. Steeling himself, he flung open the garage door and shouted, "Make one move, and I'll put you down." The intruder, a young man in dark clothing and gloves with wide, frightened eyes, froze immediately. Ethan grabbed him by the collar and pressed the shotgun barrel to his chest. "Who sent you?" he demanded again in a low, steady tone. After a tense silence, the young man stammered, "They told me to cut the line. They mentioned the name Langley." With that, Ethan released him and ordered, "Get out and tell Langley he's made a grave mistake." The would-be saboteur bolted into the night, leaving Ethan to process the implications. Langley was not just a name, it was the architect behind these escalating measures. Realizing he needed more concrete evidence, Ethan began researching Langley's involvement in local property deals. His efforts uncovered that Langley was not only an investor, but also controlled multiple shell companies tied to lucrative city contracts, the same contracts Darren Ellis had been aggressively promoting. Langley had effectively replaced Darren, and now it was clear that he was orchestrating the entire campaign against Ethan's property. The revelation was a turning point. Ethan decided it was time to take decisive action. That evening, he reached out to an old friend known for handling situations with ruthless efficiency. The conversation over a burner phone was curt. "I need everything you can dig up on Langley," Ethan said, his tone edged with determination. After a brief pause, his friend replied, "There's an old project called Brookside Expansion from 5 years ago, a high-end residential development that mysteriously collapsed amid bribery, hush money, and unexplained disappearances. Langley's name was all over it." Ethan's mind raced. Brookside had been the talk of the town before vanishing into obscurity, and now it appeared that Langley had a history of eliminating obstacles. Armed with this clue, Ethan spent hours poring over city records related to Brookside. Permits had been filed and money exchanged, yet the project had simply evaporated, leaving behind a list of landowners who had sold their properties hastily. Among those names, Ethan's eyes locked onto Darren Ellis's, a clear sign that Darren had once been entangled in these dubious dealings and may have tried to extricate himself by selling out. Determined to uncover the full truth, Ethan made his way to Darren's former office building. Although the building was dark and locked, his expertise allowed him to pick the side door's lock quickly. Inside, the office was a mess. Desks upturned, filing cabinets emptied, and documents strewn about in disarray. Amid the chaos, Ethan discovered a manila folder tucked away under a desk. Its contents were damning. Copies of internal emails, financial records, and a terse letter from Darren to Langley dated just 3 weeks earlier. In that letter, Darren had warned, "I know what you did with Brookside. Either include me in your next move or I go public." The discovery confirmed that Darren had grown greedy and rebellious, and that his fate was sealed when he challenged Langley. Before Ethan could process the implications, he heard a car door slam outside. Acting swiftly, he shoved the folder into his jacket and slipped out a back exit. Dodging through side corridors and empty parking lots, he managed to disappear into the night. Once safely home, he made copies of the documents and distributed them to the local newspaper, a trusted lawyer who had once dismissed his case, and an insurance contact. He reasoned that if anything were to happen to him, the truth would still be known. By morning, headlines blasted a massive land fraud scandal implicating Langley. City officials scrambled to distance themselves, and within hours, Langley's office was raided, resulting in his arrest. That very night, as Ethan sat on his porch with a beer and watched the sun dip below the horizon, a different vehicle pulled up, a police cruiser. Two officers, one older and one younger, approached him. The older officer stated gravely, "Mr. Carter, Darren Ellis is missing." The younger officer added that eyewitnesses had seen someone lingering near Darren's location after hours in a truck suspiciously similar to Ethan's. Ethan calmly replied, "I was right here all night. I have security footage to prove it." The officers exchanged glances before the older one closed his notepad with a resigned sigh. "Just don't leave town," he cautioned as they departed. Ethan's mind raced as he considered the implications of Darren's disappearance. It wasn't simply a case of intimidation anymore. Someone was eliminating loose ends. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Ethan drove back to the Ellis Properties office the following morning. The parking lot was nearly empty, and the luxury sedan had vanished, indicating that the suited man was either in hiding or had fled. Undeterred, Ethan entered the building. At the reception desk, a tired receptionist in her 30s glanced up, surprised. "You're not supposed to be here," she muttered, but Ethan's calm reply, "Neither is your boss," prompted her to lower her voice. "They told me to keep quiet," she admitted. Leaning in, she confided that Darren had been anxious all week, taking secret calls and repeatedly mentioning someone named Sullivan. Ethan's curiosity deepened, but before he could press further, the receptionist's eyes widened as a black SUV crawled slowly into the lot. "They're watching," she whispered. A silent nod from Ethan, and he left without another word, driving home along a circuitous route to avoid detection. For the next several days, the silence was unnerving. No further overt threats or violent acts occurred. Ethan took advantage of the lull to further bolster his home's defenses, reinforcing doors, installing additional sensors, and ensuring that his truck was securely locked away in the garage. But the calm was deceptive. On the fourth night, he heard a distinct scraping sound at his garage door. Quietly, he reached for his shotgun and crept toward the window, where he saw a shadow near his truck, likely attempting to sabotage the fuel line once more. With no time to waste, he flung open the garage door and confronted the intruder. "Move and I'll drop you," Ethan warned sharply. The intruder, a young man with a look of sheer terror, froze immediately. Ethan grabbed him by the collar and, pressing the cold barrel of his shotgun against his chest, demanded, "Who sent you?" After a prolonged silence, the trembling young man managed to choke out, "Sullivan! They told me to cut the line!" Ethan's eyes burned with resolve as he released the terrified intruder. "Get out and tell Sullivan that he's made a huge mistake," he ordered. The youth bolted into the darkness, leaving Ethan alone with the painful truth that his battle had grown far larger than a simple land dispute. Realizing that he needed to turn the tables, Ethan began an exhaustive investigation into Sullivan's network. He discovered that Sullivan was not merely an investor, but the puppeteer behind a series of corrupt land deals, controlling multiple shell companies tied to city contracts, the very same contracts Darren Ellis had been pushing. It became evident that Darren had been nothing more than a pawn in Sullivan's grand scheme. With this realization, Ethan decided it was time to strike back. That night, he made another call to an old friend renowned for getting results without questions. When his friend answered, the voice was curt and businesslike. "I need every scrap of information you can find on Sullivan," Ethan demanded. After a brief pause, his contact replied, Check out a project called Brookside Expansion from 5 years ago. A housing development that mysteriously collapsed after questionable deals and hush money. Sullivan's fingerprints are all over it. Ethan recalled that Brookside had been a high-end residential venture that vanished without a trace. As he sifted through city records, he found that while permits had been issued and funds exchanged, the project had simply evaporated, leaving behind only a list of landowners who had sold their properties prematurely. Among those names was Darren Ellis. It appeared Darren had once attempted to extricate himself from Sullivan's clutches by selling out, but this time he was fighting back. Determined to expose the corruption, Ethan made his way to Darren's abandoned office. The building, though dark and locked, yielded its secrets when Ethan quickly picked the side door's lock. Inside, chaos reigned. Desks were overturned, filing cabinets lay open, and papers were scattered. Yet amidst the disarray, Ethan uncovered a manila folder stuffed under a desk. Within it were internal emails, financial records, and a short biting letter from Darren to Sullivan dated 3 weeks prior. The letter read simply, "I know what you did with Brookside. Either include me in your next move, or I go public." This was the turning point. Darren had grown greedy and defiant, and his challenge to Sullivan had sealed his fate. Before Ethan could absorb the full impact, he heard the sound of a car door slam outside. Realizing that Sullivan's operatives were on the move, he quickly tucked the documents into his jacket and slipped out through a back exit. Navigating dark corridors and empty parking lots with practiced caution, he managed to elude pursuit and returned home, exhausted. Once safely inside, he scanned and copied the incriminating documents, then sent them simultaneously to the local news, his once dismissive lawyer, and a trusted insurance contact. His plan was simple. If anything happened to him, the truth would still emerge. By morning, headlines screamed of a massive land fraud scandal implicating Sullivan. City officials scrambled to distance themselves, and by midday, Sullivan's office was raided and the mastermind was taken into custody. That evening, as Ethan sat on his porch watching the sunset, his thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a police cruiser. Not the intimidating vehicles of his foes, but an official sign that the tide was turning. 2 officers, one with graying hair and one younger and more determined, approached him. The older officer stated calmly, "Mr. Carter, Darren Ellis is missing." The younger one added that surveillance footage showed someone lingering near Darren's property after hours in a vehicle similar to Ethan's. With quiet confidence, Ethan replied, "I was right here all night, and my security footage proves it." After a brief exchange of glances, the older officer closed his notepad and said, "Just don't leave town, Mr. Carter." As the cruiser faded away, Ethan knew that Darren's disappearance was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger scheme to eliminate loose ends, and now he was the only one left. Determined to expose every detail, Ethan returned to the Ellis Properties office once more. The parking lot was nearly deserted, and the luxury sedan was nowhere in sight. Inside, he found the receptionist again, who admitted in hushed tones that Darren had been unnerved all week, mentioning a name he couldn't fully explain. Sullivan. Before Ethan could press further, she whispered, "They're watching." Her words were accompanied by the sound of a black SUV slowly pulling into the lot. With a silent nod, Ethan left immediately, taking a convoluted route home to avoid any prying eyes. Over the next few days, nothing overtly violent occurred, a deceptive lull that gave Ethan time to reinforce his property further and maintain constant vigilance. Yet on the 4th night, as he lay awake listening to the faint, deliberate scraping at his garage door, he realized the enemy was preparing for a more direct assault. With his shotgun at the ready, he crept toward the source of the noise. In the dim light, he spotted a shadow near his truck, presumably attempting yet another act of sabotage. Without hesitation, he opened the garage door, stepping out and raising his weapon. "Move, and I drop you," he commanded. The intruder, a young man barely in his 20s, dressed in dark clothing and gloves, froze in terror. Ethan grabbed him by the collar and pressed the shotgun barrel to his chest, demanding once more, "Who sent you?" After a tense silence, the frightened youth managed to choke out, "Langley! They told me to sabotage your truck." Ethan's heart pounded as he released the man, warning, "Get out and tell Langley he's made a huge mistake." The youth bolted, leaving Ethan standing alone, realizing that his battle had now evolved into something far more dangerous. A war for control. Realizing that his next move had to be calculated and offensive, Ethan dedicated himself to uncovering every shred of evidence linking Sullivan's network to the fraudulent land deals. Hours of research revealed that Sullivan was the mastermind behind a web of shell companies and corrupt contracts, a network that extended far beyond Darren Ellis's isolated actions. This revelation filled Ethan with determination. That night, he called an old associate known for his discreet but effective work in exposing corruption. When the call connected, the associate's voice was low and unyielding. "I'll get you everything on Sullivan. Start with the Brookside expansion project from 5 years ago," he advised. Ethan recalled that Brookside had been a promising high-end housing development that inexplicably collapsed amid bribery and hush deals. Digging into the city records, Ethan uncovered a trail of permits, transactions, and a final list of landowners who had sold their lots under pressure, one of which was Darren Ellis's name. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align. Compelled to see the full extent of the conspiracy, Ethan returned to Darren's old office building one final time. The building, though ransacked, still harbored remnants of the truth. Amid overturned desks and scattered papers, he found a manila folder containing internal emails, financial documents, and a terse letter from Darren to Sullivan. In that letter, Darren had warned, "I know what you did with Brookside. Either cut me in or I go public." This undeniable evidence confirmed that Darren had once been complicit, but had chosen to rebel, and in doing so, had sealed his own fate. Before Ethan could finish processing this explosive information, the sound of heavy footsteps and a car door slamming echoed outside. Sensing that professional operatives were closing in, he hastily tucked the documents into his jacket and slipped out a back exit. Dodging through dim hallways and deserted parking areas, he managed to evade detection and return home safely. Exhausted, yet resolute, he scanned and copied the incriminating files, then sent them to the local press, his lawyer, and a trusted insurance contact, ensuring that if he were silenced, the truth would still prevail. By morning, news outlets were broadcasting a massive land fraud scandal implicating Sullivan and his cronies. In a dramatic turn of events, city officials distanced themselves, and within hours, Sullivan was arrested following a raid on his office. That night, as Ethan relaxed on his porch with a beer, the events of the past weeks began to settle into a hard-won clarity. A different vehicle approached, a police cruiser this time, and 2 officers stepped out. The older one, with a measured tone, informed him, "Mr. Carter, Darren Ellis is missing." The younger officer, eyes narrowed, mentioned that security cameras had captured suspicious activity near Darren's property, and that witnesses had seen someone in a truck reminiscent of Ethan's. Ethan calmly set his beer down and replied, "I was here all night. My security footage can confirm that." The officers exchanged glances, and after a moment, the older officer closed his notepad. "Just stay in town, Mr. Carter," he advised before departing. Ethan realized that Darren's disappearance was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger purge designed to eliminate anyone who could expose the corruption. With his property now marked as a battleground, Ethan resolved that he would no longer be a passive victim. At dawn, he parked outside the nearly empty Ellis Properties lot once more. The absence of the black sedan confirmed that the suited man was no longer in the area. Undeterred, Ethan marched into the building and approached the reception desk. The receptionist, looking even more wary than before, muttered, "You shouldn't be here." Ethan replied quietly, "Neither should your boss." The woman hesitated, then said, "They warned me to keep my mouth shut." Leaning in, she added, Darren was terrified last week. He kept mentioning someone named Sullivan, claiming he wouldn't let Sullivan force him out. Before Ethan could ask further, she whispered, "They're watching." A black SUV had pulled into the lot, and her voice trembled with fear. With a curt nod, Ethan left the building, driving home along winding side streets to avoid detection. For several days after, nothing overtly violent occurred, a deceptive quiet that allowed Ethan to further prepare. He reinforced every door, installed extra sensors, and ensured that his truck remained hidden in the garage. Yet on the fourth night, a deliberate scraping sound at his garage door shattered the calm. Ethan, armed with his shotgun, crept toward the noise. In the dim light, he saw a shadow near his truck, likely attempting to sabotage the fuel line once more. Without delay, he opened the garage door and confronted the intruder. "Move and I'll drop you," he warned. The young man, clad in dark attire and gloves with wide, fearful eyes, froze immediately. Gripping him by the collar and pressing the shotgun barrel against his chest, Ethan demanded, "Who sent you?" After a moment of tense silence, the intruder choked out, "Langley. They told me to cut the line and leave." Ethan's resolve hardened as he released the trembling youth, instructing him, "Get out and tell Langley he's made a huge mistake." The intruder bolted into the darkness, and Ethan was left alone, realizing that his battle had escalated into full-blown warfare. Determined to turn the tables, Ethan spent the next several hours gathering every scrap of evidence linking Sullivan's network to fraudulent land deals. His research confirmed that Sullivan was the mastermind, pulling strings behind multiple shell companies and corrupt contracts, an intricate web designed to force property owners like him out. With irrefutable evidence in hand, Ethan arranged a meeting with an old ally known for his ability to uncover dirt on men like Sullivan without asking questions. At exactly noon the following day, Ethan arrived in the parking lot behind the modest Ellis Properties building. The black sedan was absent, and the suited man was nowhere in sight. The quiet was palpable as Ethan walked into the building one final time. A terse conversation with the receptionist confirmed that Darren had been in trouble, mentioning once again the ominous name Sullivan. Before leaving, she warned, "They're watching." Ethan nodded, silently vowing that he would no longer be intimidated. That night, as Ethan sat in his dark living room, his thoughts churned with plans for retaliation. Suddenly, he heard the distant rumble of a large truck approaching. This was not an ordinary vehicle, but a menacing sign that his adversaries were ready to escalate their efforts. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed his shotgun and stepped outside, prepared to defend his home at all costs. The truck revved its engine, tires screeching on the asphalt as it barreled toward his house. Ethan fired a single, resounding shot into the air, a warning shot that caused the truck to skid to a halt before retreating. Clutching his weapon, Ethan felt the adrenaline surge through him. They had tried to run him down, but he was ready for the next move. Not content to merely defend his territory, Ethan drove directly to City Hall. Although he lacked direct evidence of the ongoing threats, he possessed the critical document proving that Ellis Properties had already claimed his land through fraudulent means. Requesting every public record related to the company's recent projects, permits, zoning changes, and financial transactions, he spent hours combing through the records. Buried deep among the files, he found the damning document. A signed agreement granting Ellis Properties rights to develop on land that included his own. The realization that his property had been legally taken from him without his consent stoked his resolve. He made multiple copies and sent them to the local newspaper, sympathetic city council members, and his lawyer, ensuring that the truth could not be suppressed. By morning, the scandal exploded in the media. Reports detailed suspicious land deals, missing funds, and a massive real estate fraud implicating Sullivan's entire operation. As city officials scrambled to distance themselves, news spread that Sullivan was under investigation and his office had been raided. Within hours, the mastermind found himself in handcuffs. That evening, while Ethan sat on his porch, sipping a beer and watching the sun set over what remained of his once pristine hedge, Darren Ellis unexpectedly appeared. Bruised and limping, Darren's survival was a testament to his resilience. "You look terrible," Ethan remarked. Darren managed a weak chuckle. "You should have seen the other guy," he replied. Ethan gestured for him to come inside. Once seated, Darren explained, "I tried to take the deal, but Sullivan's men nearly finished me off. They left me for dead, but I pulled through." Ethan shook his head. "So why did you risk it all?" Darren's eyes flickered with a mixture of defiance and regret. "I knew you wouldn't accept their offer. I left those documents where I thought you'd find them, hoping you'd uncover the truth." Ethan's voice was even as he replied, "You used me, Darren. We're even now, but the fight isn't over." Darren leaned forward, wincing slightly. "Now? Now we finish this?" Ethan considered his next move carefully. "How on earth did you survive?" he asked. Darren smirked bitterly. "They grabbed me a week ago, took me to an abandoned lot, roughed me up, and put a gun to my head. They assumed I was dead because of my cracked skull. But I'm still here." Ethan scoffed. "You really thought I needed backup?" Darren grinned. "You were doing fine on your own." Ethan shook his head, acknowledging that, while he had already borne the brunt of the assault, Darren's survival meant that Sullivan had not entirely won. "So what now?" Ethan asked. Darren replied, "We expose Sullivan. I know a guy, someone who can dig up the kind of dirt that will make even Sullivan tremble." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "And what kind of guy is that?" Darren simply smirked and said, "The kind you don't question." Though Ethan was uneasy with the vagueness, he had little choice but to agree. "Fine, but we do this my way from now on," he warned. Darren raised his hands in mock surrender. "Whatever you say, Carter." In the ensuing days, while the media hammered down on Sullivan and his fraudulent empire, Darren worked diligently behind the scenes. Their efforts eventually uncovered a bank account linked not directly to Sullivan, but to one of his shell companies. Millions of dollars funneled offshore through dummy corporations. This discovery was the final nail in the coffin. With the evidence in hand, the next morning the headlines blared. "Massive land fraud scandal, Sullivan under investigation." As city officials scrambled to extricate themselves from the fallout, Sullivan's office was raided, and he was swiftly taken into custody. That evening, as Ethan sat on his porch watching the last rays of sunlight dance over his battered hedge, Darren reappeared. This time not as an aggressor, but as an ally. Bruised yet determined, he greeted Ethan. "You look like hell, but you're still standing." Ethan smiled wryly. "So what now?" Darren replied, "Now I rebuild and make damn sure no one ever tries to take what's mine again." Ethan offered a smirk. "If you ever need help, don't even think about it." Darren chuckled, clinking his glass against Ethan's beer bottle before disappearing down the quiet street. Ethan watched him go, then turned back to his home, his land, and the legacy he had fought so hard to protect. It had cost him more than he ever expected, but through grit, determination, and a refusal to back down, he had reclaimed control of his property and his destiny, and that, in the end, was all that truly mattered.